So at this point, I would like to show you guys the discussion that I had with Vinay. Regular viewers will know Vinay Orekondy. He's an attorney and activist. I met him on the Bernie Sanders campaign in New Hampshire, and we've kept in touch since then. He is a labor attorney. He's involved with labor organizing groups and unions and things like that, and has some insight on those issues. We talked a little bit about actually what I was just talking about, the Democrats' inaction and the political consequences of that. And we also talked a little bit more broadly about some of the fringe narratives going on right now and how, how the left and the right are both kind of engaging in some of these fringe narratives, and Vinay gave his opinion on how we got to that place. So I do want to apologize for the quality of this, you guys. I was out of town this last week, so this is not recorded with my mic and camera. This is recorded on my laptop, and I apologize if the quality is not quite what it usually is. But this is Vinay Orekondy and discussing, what's going on in politics right now, discussing the reconciliation bill and discussing the fringe narratives that we're seeing kind of take over our politics. Happy to welcome back to the show, friend of the show, Vinay Orekondy. Vinay is an attorney and activist and has been a regular. Thanks, as always, for taking the time today.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So I wanted to start just by getting your broad views on the reconciliation bill and the infrastructure bill, the tie-in there, how you think the progressive caucus and the squad handled it, how you think Joe Biden handled it. How do you see this impacting the left and how much power we wield going forward, that kind of thing?
Yeah, look, obviously the whole situation has been a nightmare. And I've got to say, I don't know what Sinema is thinking. Like, I've never seen anyone engage in this kind of self-destructive behavior. It's like, it's not even politically advantageous. It's one thing if if she is, obviously she's getting donations from, but donations can only carry you so far if your approval rating is like 20% or something, has it sunk down to. So what I suspect is that on some level, she truly believes in what she's doing. And that's like that or maybe she thinks that she'll get, she hasn't thought about the primaries, or maybe she thinks she'll just somehow get through the primaries and that Republicans and independents will save her. Or but the worst case scenario is that is that she actually truly believes in this stuff, in which case, the Democratic Party is a lot worse off than we thought.
Very quickly on Sinema, I've heard speculation from people that she literally just might not intend to run again, that she just might want one of the revolving door jobs to pop up when she leaves. Do you see any validity to that? It's very rare for someone who holds that kind of power to just willfully give up their seat. But like, she's like, to your point, she's behaving in ways that are so out of line with what would be politically beneficial to her that I think it's actually reasonable to speculate about that she might be thinking post-Senate career with her conduct here.
That's entirely possible, and I'd be, I wouldn't be surprised. I can't say it like she certainly like set everything up for that, if that's what she wants to do. That's because maybe she thought this is it. I'm not going to get another shot. So may as well set up for that, if that is a goal. In fact, I to be honest, I hope that's the case, rather than the alternative, which I just talked about. Because if you've got people in the Democratic Party, like their senators, truly believing in this stuff, then essentially they've adopted the Republican Party's old philosophy, and that's it. It's game over, really.
So, I mean, to take it off of Sinema and Manchin, because I think I tend to think that they're a little bit less abnormal in the Democratic Party than I think it's been reported. I think there are plenty of members of the Senate and the House that are happy to rhetorically say they support these very popular socioeconomic provisions and hide behind, well, I really did want to do it, but Sinema and Manchin, I think there's a revolving door element to this. I think there's some truth to that. But from the Biden administration's perspective, you mentioned the polling numbers. I mean, Kamala Harris is polling at 28% right now. Biden's just over 30 last I saw. I mean, how can a party so threw this whole situation up from a self-interested political perspective. How I don't even see the greedy, rapacious incentive structure that I normally see and can make sense of here, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, look, they are. Sorry, are you hearing that noise? Is that okay?
You're good.
Okay, all right. So what it was. Look, why they do this? All right, look, my theory on what's going on is this: is that I think Joe Biden actually does see the direction that the country, like that the party is moving. I think that's why he's been at least somewhat amenable to it. But I don't think he's got the guts to kind of take on parts of his party, partly because he thinks it's his duty to kind of keep the party together. I think there's a sort of a philosophy of like, we're a broad tent, we have to keep the party unified, which is, I think that I think has been the kind of the problem within the Democratic Party for a long time, is that they believe that, okay, well, because we've got this broad tent, we've got to keep it together. That's how we maintain a majority. That's their philosophy, right? And the issue is that you get, and I've seen this actually happen with like left parties around the world, right? Is that they've sort of crept towards the center in this desire to kind of maintain power, and then when they actually have power, they don't really do anything, or they don't achieve much, and that fuel because of their like desire to like their fear. And I think this is a product of being like post globalization. You've got this very demoralized left, right? That has think, well, we've got to sort of adapt to the other side. We've got to kind of become like the other side, and and part of, and to some extent, adapting to your settings is important, but just sort of literally becoming your opponents is not the point, right? That's not how you adapt, right? That's caving in, that's losing, right? That's just at that point, it's an ego trip. It's like, well, as long as we're the bastards in power, as opposed to them being the bastards in power, right? So this is kind of this process has gone on in like it happened in our Labor Party in Australia, right? Exactly the same thing, right? But because of that, what you have is that's had a psychological effect on the population, I think, as well. Is that it's created this self-fulfilling prophecy when I think even the populations are a little bit scared now of progressive politics, right? So unfortunately, I think that as progressives, we've kind of got to like normalize progressive ideas again. And I think that's, Bernie has gone a long way towards doing that, right? If I look at, there's conversations happening now that I just would have thought were impossible a couple of years ago, like, especially the stuff around labor, like people, like the response to this ridiculous signs about, oh, no one wants to work anymore. There's a consistent response. Doesn't matter across the ideological spectrum, and this is beautiful, right? Saying pay your workers properly, right? And that's some people credit the pandemic for this. I'm sure that's part of it. Like it doesn't really matter what the point is that progressive ideas are getting normalized now, and I think there are multiple ways to do this. So I've always been of the belief that a movement should use whatever tools it can. Like, and that's the really big picture approach, right? So I think that House progressives, I think, have they've put up a pretty good fight. I thought they put a pretty good fight together. I think if they tanked the bill and got blamed for it, that would ultimately be more detrimental to progressive power. So I think that whether they get screwed over now, we don't know, right? But I think that they've made a tactical choice. And I think they probably looked at the numbers and the six that voted no, right? I think that they probably looked and said, look, we can vote no because there's enough numbers to pass this and maintain it. Because so I think that in the larger picture, like tanking the bill would not have benefited us, right?
So, okay, my objection, though, comes not from this vote, but from allowing the reconciliation bill to be gutted like it was. So
Right.
my objection is more from like you point out, we need to popularize the ideas, but a lot of these ideas already have 70, 80+% support. So at what point can we drag the Democrats on? Like, do we need 90, 95? I mean, like at what point they continue capitulating even on issues when they have 80% support across party lines? I mean, I my issue, I think, is less with the politics that the progressives engaged in here to pair the bills and how they strategize trying to pass the Build Back Better bill. It's more with like, I don't think that Build Back Better bill is hardly any good anymore. So
Right.
how do we get them to fight at that point of the process?
Yeah, I think, look, that this is a tricky question, right? Because I put a combination of tools, and I think one of the things that I think that we need to do, just for the record, is that we absolutely need to be building up more power outside the Democratic Party. Absolutely, right? So, and I think that would be, so I'm thinking of this from a long-term strategy perspective. So to answer your question, is that we need more pressure from the left, right? And I don't think that would entirely be achieved from within the party, right? I just don't think so. Like the truth is that the biggest threat to the Democratic Party and the biggest thing which will force the party to continue to move to the left is if there's another threat from the left, right? If there's something further left that can peel them off, right? So we've got to be building that up. Whatever, it might not be a political party. It could be I don't know, it could be like some sort of movement which encourages people not to vote. I don't know. Like, I'm not saying that's a good thing either, but we just need something that is where the 70, 80% of the population are, right? And is gaining power and puts itself at odds with the Democratic Party. So that, I think, is where the true pressure will come from. So I think what that would do is actually give progressives inside the Democratic Party more power to play with, right? So this is why I've always been of the opinion that it is a singular movement, right? And but the amount of power that they have to play with is the amount of power that we create, right? And we don't have that thing to the left of the Democratic Party yet. We don't, right? Not in any meaningful or organized. I mean, there are projects, there are efforts, there are things underway that might turn into that, or they might not. But I don't think we're there yet. In the way that the right has had that for a long time, right?
Yeah.
And now they've got literally Donald Trump sitting as a specter on the side with no official position, right? So they've got that, right?
He's calling Mike McCarthy, what's his name, McCarthy, down to his freaking Mar-a-Lago and telling him what to do in Congress. I mean, it's insane.
Right. So but like the thing is that the right didn't get there overnight, so they didn't get there to the point where Donald Trump became their de facto kind of leader. It didn't happen by accident. That was a result of Fox News doing weird stuff for years, right? So this is what I mean by normalizing these ideas. It's about normalizing it's not just a matter of popularity, right? Because I'm sure a lot of the ideas that Trump talks about were popular on the right even before Fox News existed. It's normalizing is also about organizing, right? It's about having centers of power that can push buttons in the way that Trump does on the right, right? Is that we don't have the ability yet to really push those buttons. And I think that because the problem is that, because you notice that the annoying argument that Democrats will always put to us, right, is that, well, where are you going to go? Or like, it's the and that notice those discussions don't really happen on the right? Because they said we know we're right here, right? So it's there's no lesser of two. Like, obviously from their perspective, we're evil, right? Okay, so let's like taking that into account. They don't have that lesser of two evils argument really anymore. So we've got it, and the reason they were to do that is because they created power outside the party, right? A center of power. And I think it's Fox News was that center of power, right? Or the beginnings of one, right?
Yeah, the whole Murdoch empire, really.
Right. So we need centers of power outside of that, like strong centers of power outside the party, really put that pressure. I don't know if this answered your question, but I think that, like, I guess I'm someone who views the larger picture. I look at things through the very big picture. and say, well, for me, this result was, obviously they were going to, and I think Bernie, even when he campaigned for president, and even when he put forward his ideas for legislation, all of that, he knew that it was going to get stripped back. He knew it. They all knew it. So that they went bold, saying we're probably going to get a third of this, right? But what does that mean? What's the maths of it? Is that they looked at how much power they had, how much leverage they had, and I think that they used a lot of it, right? But ultimately, mathematically, there isn't enough external pressure on the party, and that's on us, right? That is on us because we haven't organized yet, right? Or at least, yeah.
What do you say to? And I could actually see this going either way. So, like, whatever your opinion is, please explain. But I could see the Democrats' inaction and capitulation here turning people off from organizing in that way. And I also could see it motivating people to organize in that way. So, like, how do you see that kind of influencing our capacity to actually engage in that kind of activism and organizing?
Yes, I see it happening in a couple of ways, and I think both of them are good, right? So one is that I've seen a lot of talk that are contradictory talk, but I think both are useful. One is that it's clear as day what's happening. You have people like Sinema around. We've got to primary them, right? And so I've seen a lot more energy around that, right? So that was actually, people like who are the work within the Democratic Party progressives have always been saying that. Now that energy is intensified, right? And because they know they've got backing, right? When you've got like people like wildly unpopular and potentially just setting themselves up for the revolving door, that like Sinema would be probably the easiest senator primary in history if she ran again, right? So there's a lot of energy behind that, but simultaneously and contradictorily, you're seeing an energy of like, well, we told you so. You engage with the Democrats, this was happened. And it's actually worse than we said it would be, right? So a lot more people who are sort of that way inclined are going to drop off. And potentially, I hope that they don't drop off and like just do nothing. I hope they organize, whether it be a third party or get involved in unions or community organize. I think that's what, and I think that energy, a lot of that energy will translate into, if not political energy, into like sort of community organizing energy from people who've given up on the political process, right? I think both forms of energy are really useful and necessary, right? Because of what I said earlier, because you need that external source of pressure, right? And so what we'll see is that I think a lot of the energy that gives up on the party, rightfully so, will translate into that pressure, that external pressure, right? That can, that essentially could be our equivalent of whatever the hell Trump is doing, right? Yeah. So if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And the last thing on this reconciliation before we get into some of the culture stuff, I just wanted to get your opinion on the one thing I've been kind of encouraged by is we talk a lot about like MMT, deficit spending, that kind of thing, fiscal responsibility, quote unquote. And I've seen some movement, I think, on that line of rhetoric. It seems like when the Joe Manchins of the world try to say I'm being fiscally responsible, he gets a lot more pushback than he did previously, because I think people understand that deficits are not inherently bad. They're not as scary as they've been made out to be for decades. Do you see that kind of understanding about the fiscal process improving the left's ability to make their arguments when you don't have this hurdle in your way of you're being fiscally irresponsible, how are you going to pay for it, yada, yada, yada? I'm just curious your thoughts there, because that's the encouraging thing that I've seen of all of this.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's the funny thing is that like I mean, that could be a reason for it. I can't say for sure what the cause of it is, but what I do know is that right now there's only two politicians in federally who sound like Bush era Republicans, because the rest of the Republican Party is talking about crazy like culture war issue stuff, right? They're tweeting that Big Bird is a communist. Okay?
Yeah. Josh Hawley's talking about boys playing video games and jacking off and like thinking that's some sort of serious political Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it might be on their side. Like I don't know. Like
yeah.
So in other words, that even though they're all voting against these bills, right? they're not talking about it, which is interesting. Like they're not saying, then you're not getting this big Republican push saying these bills are fiscally irresponsible, which is interesting, right? Because they're distracted by all this other stuff, and because they're what's red meat for their base, right? And so there's only 2 senators who actually sound like Bush era Republicans, right? So, and it feels really, really out of place. That's the thing. So like it essentially feels like you've got 50 senators who are just like in a world of their own, like, then you've got these 2 who are like holdouts from like 2004 and the other party, right?
And to be clear, you mean Manchin and Sinema, right?
Yeah. So that's the thing. So because you've only got these 2, right, that are still making these noises, right, they're standing out. I don't know quite how we got to this point, whether it's because of the theories that you're talking about, or if it's just, because the old ideas are no longer popular. Whatever it is, those ideas have fallen out of fashion, right? And that's a great thing. That is a great thing, right? So I think that form of thinking is on its way out, right? Some people will say maybe not. I mean, look, there's 50 Republican senators who still voted against the bill, but I wouldn't be surprised if in future you see movement on the right in that direction as well, because I think that's another discussion. Yeah.
Well, speaking of the right, we wanted to touch a little bit on some of the crazy culture conflict lines that have developed. And I wanted to start this conversation by mentioning, I don't know if you saw Jon Stewart on Jake Tapper. He did a wonderful job of calling out the media's tendency to, instead of providing information, to find a conflict line that they can exploit for viewership, right? So the example he gave that I thought was pretty spot on is, he said, you see lots of videos of people screaming at each other over masks or vaccines or what have you. And I'm not even saying like that's newsworthy, share it. I'm not saying it's not, but there's no real discussion on these major media outlets of like, hey, let's have a microbiologist on to explain why the vaccines and the masks are effective. So like instead of informing the public, it seems like they jump to these cultural conflict lines most of the time that exploit, an issue for viewership. And I'm curious, just how do you think we got to this point where such topics were so inflammatory, and where we have people that are taking such extraordinarily extreme positions on something that seems like it should be objective, like it's science, it's medicine. How did we get here?
Yeah, so this is a complicated answer, right? But ultimately, because the answer isn't found in the immediate, right? It's like, I obviously agree with everything you're saying, and I think, but the problem, I mean, the truth is the problem is globalization and the effects of globalization. I think that what has happened is that identity, like I think people's identity has been stripped away, and so as a result, you've got these desires to form identities and latch onto identities and to find, and part of identity is knowing what you're not, right? So I think a lot of Republicans as well, especially, have latched onto a particular identity and they've identified their opponent. Anything that comes from that opponent, they will oppose, right? Mm-hmm. And through, and there are certain, I mean, we could get into the depths of the pathways of why things like vaccines have become part of this discussion, because, and they're pretty insidious, right? Like, some of them, and this is not explicit, right? But, some of them is because of like weird neo-Nazi thinking about like purity of blood and maintaining purity of your race, right? That's where some of it comes from. But some of it also comes from, and this is part of the discussion we were having earlier before the show, some of it also comes from like kind of the mysticist or spiritual side of things that has been on like amongst like lefty hippie culture for a long time, where there's this where medical science is kind of seen as impacting your relation, like it's this artificial mechanical thing from this like hard cold world which is disconnecting you from nature, right? And those two worlds are sort of are starting to mix with each other quite strongly. So what is happening is that, so to the short answer to your question is that as a result of globalization stripping away collective identities, right, is that it's created a need for identity, and so people have latched onto certain forms of identity, right, and I think some of those are really that are really insidious, right, and they have set themselves up in opposition to anything coming from their opponent, right. So part of the mythology is of the, you know, the part of their, you know, their mythos is that the global elites are trying to control us. Well, what could be a better way to control than literally putting something inside your bloodstream, right? So, you know, and you combine that with, like, you know, the very realistic distrust of pharmaceutical companies, right? You know, these are clearly profit entities, right? You combine that with, you know, stuff from 4chan about like a neo-Nazis in there, right? And who read stuff about things like, yeah, like let's keep the blood pure. Like all of this stuff is intermingling, and it hasn't congealed into a singular coherent ideology yet. But that's where it's all happening, right? So then that's why, like, the mask thing, like, on some weird level, I kind of understand the anti-vaxxers. Like, if you come from a position of fear, right, then you know, them, the great evil, them trying to put something in your bloodstream is on some level understandable. But the really thing that confused me was the anti-masks. That was like, because there was just nothing logical about that. Like it's like literally a piece of cloth over your face, and they were saying, oh, they're trying to put a harness on us. That's your restraint, and that was the point. It's just literally like anything that will come from them is going to be the enemy, because their mythos, their identity that they've latched onto, because they don't have an identity, so they've latched onto this identity that requires rejecting anything from the other side. Otherwise, their mind will just implode. Like that's where we're at.
I think that's a fair point. I think most of their identity is not so much a positive affirmation of anything as it is a negative affirmation of the enemy, right, of the opponent, where that's kind of the starting point for much of what they say anyway. But yeah, to your point, like, why aren't they viscerally protesting seatbelts if they're so up in arms about the government's making me put something on? You know, it seems very odd that this is such a specific. You know, and I've never once seen one of these people protest that a child has to get a polio vaccine before they can go to school. So it seems like they've kind of selected this, you know what I mean, and made it seem different from other things that are actually quite comparable, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to try and claim that any of this is logical.
Okay, there we go. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's you know, it's more like. And I guess how they would respond, I'm trying to put myself in their shoes, and is that like, well, they would respond, well, the polio vaccine's been around for a long time, right? And you know, it's, yeah. And the problem is if you ask 10 different people on their side, you probably get at least 4 different answers, right? And they won't be consistent. They'll probably contradict each other, right? And that's a sign that they haven't fully formed or congealed into anything logical. And that will be their undoing ultimately, is because you can't build a movement of, I mean, you can up to a point. You can build, you know, incoherent, non-logical movements, but you can't build a society of non-logical thinking, right? Because ultimately, to progress, your society has to be tactical and compete with the opponents, and that requires logical thinking, right? So if you suddenly have a society full of, like, you know, let's say they break off and do their own little thing, and, you know, they're not going to win because they can't think logically, right? Yeah, and so that's the you know, that's the problem they have. But I think that we're so early in the development of that philosophy or movement or whatever it is, you know, that
it's hard to predict.
Yeah, but I mean, and, you know, I see them, you know, I see that, you know, the battle between conservatives and, I don't want to say progressives, because it's It's broader than that. Although it is like progressives in the American sense of the term, right? Because in the American sense of the word progressive is, specifically, leftists, right? But progressives in the global sense of the term is people who just believe in change and its possibilities, right? Which includes everyone from Bernie Sanders through to Jeff Bezos, which is obviously a very broad group, right?
Yeah.
A very broad group, right? But people who very much dislike each other. But ultimately, that's the battle lines of this century, right? And is that we've got it's a battle between those who believe, I think, in those who embrace change and its possibilities, right? Whether for compassionate reasons or for, I don't know, profit reasons, right? Or who knows what your reason, or if you're Elon Musk because you have some vision of humanity on Mars or something, who knows, right? As opposed to just simply, I'm afraid of the world. I'm afraid of everything, so I'm just going to stick to what's known. I think that is what the 21st century is going to be about, right?
I see.
And yeah, so and that's the I think that's the international definition of the word progressive, right? And so I think that's that will be the Cold War of our era, right?
So I want to get to some of the, I've seen lefties kind of engaging with some of these narratives, and I want to get your thoughts on that. But just quickly to finish up with the right-wing culture stuff, the one thing that I couldn't really put my finger on, I don't know if you saw this, but Trump had encouraged a crowd at one of his rallies or whatever it was to get the vaccine, and they all freaking booed him. I mean, they looked like, not all, but a lot of them booed him.
Yeah.
So I that to me became kind of, in a sense, really fucking terrifying, honestly, because that meant that even he couldn't, control.
That was a really interesting moment for me as well.
Yeah.
It wasn't I wasn't surprised by it though, because like at the end of the day, like one, I wasn't surprised that Trump was promoting it, because at the end of the day, he's still like a weirdly pragmatic person. Like you think about his behavior in, the fact that he used to just donate to both parties or to whoever he wanted, whoever would suit his financial interests, right? That's who he is at his core. And he's adopted like all these extreme right-wing narratives because it suits him, right? And also because no other Republican took his campaign seriously, so you had people like Steve Bannon around him to advise him, right? So, but at the end of the day, and so his practical concern, or his concern, is he wants to be remembered by history, right? So one is he would have been of the belief that, like he's not a bright guy, I think we know that, but I think he's like knows that he's practical enough to know that vaccine science should not be a controversial thing, and he wants to be remembered by history, right? Because he's an egoist, right? He's a terribly insecure individual who wants to be remembered fondly by history, and he's terrified that history will remember him as this, the worst president ever. That's his greatest fear, right? Because obviously his daddy didn't respect him, and he's led his whole life trying to fight that. And so he wanted a narrative, and you can see this amongst the Trump circles. They wanted to push the Trump vaccine narrative. They wanted that. They were actually trying to push that idea, calling it the Trump vaccine, right? Didn't want the pharmaceutical companies. It happened during my term. Like, and you saw what was the name of her? His comms person.
Conway.
No, not her. Oh, actually, no. She's used the term Trump vaccine as well. But yeah, Kellyanne Conway though. Yeah. So there's a few of them that were using that term. They were trying to get that branding out, but it never took hold. And they've retreated from it in recent times because they know that they've sometimes said, oh, this thing is actually really unpopular. I think that the booing was the turning moment. So this the thing is that this mythos has taken hold, right? Like, and they are, which means that they're willing, whatever their collective consciousness is willing to they see Trump as like he was maybe a useful shit stirrer for a while, but they'll ditch it if they need to. And if they're smart, they'll ditch him, right? Because, maybe, who knows? We'll see what happens in 2024. But I'm starting to see he's not the end game, right? Like, and I think that we may have, on the left, we may have misunderstood that they think like perpetual Trump in power is the end game. It's not. It's, I think they just see it like they may see him as a useful idiot, right? On some level, some of them do, you know. I don't, and I think the fact he's certainly lost a lot of his power now that he's lost his Twitter account. But I know there are conversations happening on the right, like who do we run? Is it going to be Trump again? Maybe if there's no one else to run, right? But there are some of them thinking, well, how do we win? Is he the best way for us to win? So there's an us. The thing is that there's an us. We talked about identity earlier, right? There's an us. And I mean, there's always been an us, right? But it's not just a Republican us. It's a deeper us. It's that identity that we're talking about. That that mythos that that has its own story, that has its own religions. It has its own values. It has it's a thing. And Trump is might just be part of that story.
Yeah, I'd go so far as to say it's almost a dogma of sorts. It's something that they believe without any sort of reason to, right? It's almost like they're emotionally invested in this thing. I guess I thought Trump had a lot more to do with that than that moment would tend to, portray.
He does. I think consciously he does for a lot of them, but I think unconsciously he probably doesn't. I think
Gotcha.
I think the reality is that he's a catalyst. He's you think about the beginnings of movements there's a certain personality that always thrives at the beginning of movements, and it's the shitster, it's the troublemaker, it's the one that has the courage to take it to the powers that be, right? But at some point in the development of a movement, that personality isn't actually very useful anymore, and they actually become a drag on a movement. And this is history of movements. It's always the same way. Always, it doesn't matter left, right, it doesn't matter. And at some point, they give way to someone who's better at doing more institution building, right? How do we turn this incoherent sort of rabble that just gets angry into a society building machine? I think that's their end game, right? And
So,
and that they haven't got anyone yet. I would watch. And that doesn't necessarily mean running someone for president, or I mean, it will. A lot of whoever steps into that role will run. Whether
a DeSantis type or somebody like that.
Yeah, and that's their end game. And I think that's the logical end game, and I think that they may not even be consciously aware of that, but that's how movements grow, right? And it's. I mean, I think it's. There's no point being scared by it because it's inevitable.
Yeah.
We just have to adapt to it. I think.
Absolutely. So totally impossible hypothetical. I'll put you on the spot. Trump runs again. He actually runs on people getting vaccinated and tries to emphasize dealing with COVID. Do you see that group still supporting him in a full-fledged way like they did in 2016?
Well, that is impossible to know because he won't. He won't. But I think that there would. I think you would. If he ran hard on that, I think you'd get a challenger. And because a challenger from his right, and that would be fascinating and probably kind of scary to watch, but because they love him because he says what they think, right? And I think he's starting to learn that he has to be an empty vessel, right? He can't just, and that's interesting because his priority of his ego, that's his only priority, right? His ego and his own insecurities actually came into conflict with his movement. And they never had before. Never. Right? Because his ego, all it meant is I've got this willing group of people who, if I just say whatever they think, and he's good at reading people, right? That's his great strength. He's good at reading people's base desires, right? That's what he did his entire career. So if I just do what I do and read their base desires, just say it back to them, validate them, then my ego gets validated. But now he has this new prerogative, which is how will history remember me?
Yeah.
That's
fascinating.
Yeah, and he's even tweeted about, like, he said several times, I've heard this quote, it's like, hopefully these historians will remember this. Like, I've seen, he's tweeted that quite well when he
That's
had
so pathetic.
Yeah, like he's terrified that he'll be remembered as the worst president ever, right? And so that has come into conflict with what his base wants. And so it's interesting to see how he's that's why he's toned it down a lot, the vaccine stuff. He doesn't appear on like those ads or anything like that. So, and you just don't hear a lot about it. But on some level, he also probably knows it's not good to have his voters dying off in large numbers. You know?
Yeah. No, I think that's a good way to look at it, because he is like, the one thing he does well and has his whole career is marketing and keeping himself relevant and keeping his name recognizable and all that kind of stuff. So the marketing aspect of that really is, it's almost like he's treating his base like their customers. You know, I'm just going to regurgitate what they want to hear in order to please them. That does seem to be what he's done for most of his political career.
Right.
To pivot to the left side of this, because this is also something I've been quite concerned about, and I don't mean to like generalize, or, you know, I know labels can get quite dubious when we start talking about these kinds of things, but I have seen people who I would describe, and I think are self-described leftists, engaging in some of this anti-vax, anti-mask even, and the Kyle Rittenhouse one has thrown me for a loop. Some of these sort of far-right cultural trigger points. And I've seen some lefties kind of engaging with them in a, let's just say, much more sympathetic way than I would like to see. What's your take on that? What causes that? Do you think that's just inevitable? Do you think that's contrarianism? I mean, where do you think that's coming from, and where do you see it going?
Yeah, it's because the meaning of left and right is changing, right? Like that's, I think that it is inevitable. And I think let's explore how it happened first, right? It's because obviously, and for understandable reasons, there's reasons that I agree with. There's like massive distrust of global elites and and large pharmaceutical companies. It's not a strange position to have, right?
Right.
There's nothing illogical about that. However, even using the term global elites these days, for me to say that, makes you sound like a right winger, right? Because they've kind of adopted that term. But these I was out there, like I was pretty young, but I was out there and I was admiring the peak protesting against global elites in Seattle, like in '97, right? Like '99, sorry, I think it was '99, right? At the the World Trade Organization conference. This has been a lefty issue for a long time, right? Opposing global elites who have brought economic power, who've centralized it, right? So it shouldn't surprise us at all that now the right has adopted anti-globalization as their and they've done a better job than we have. Like, that's the unfortunate truth. They beat us to the punch, right? Like we've done it for much longer, but they did it better than us and quicker than us because they didn't just tap into economics. They tapped into culture, right? They tapped into identity, and they met a desire for a identity, right? Because it's one thing to talk about economics, but economics is, unless you're on the receiving end of that economics, right? It's a lot easier to mobilize people around values. And they did, right? So that's why there's I think there's crossover, but the crossover will go further than that. I think that we are going to lose sections of the left to the right, right? Because one, they're going to see that they actually succeeded, in some ways, in pushing back better than the left ever did. In fact, that parts of the self-described left, if you include the Democratic Party, the left, in that broader left coalition, if you do, then that's, some of them there'll be very people upholding those structures, right? So are we even on the right side anymore? So they'll say, well, look, and some of them will say, well, look, I disagree with all their fascism and their and their racism and all of that, but they're fighting the system, so I should join them. Like, you can't blame them for that.
No, that has its appeal. That's certainly, we can at least analyze that and understand that that has its appeal, right? Even if we disagree with the end conclusion, that is certainly appealing. Yeah, I agree.
And they'll and they'll say, well, look, it's an alliance of convenience. For a lot of them, they'll start like that, and then I don't think they'll always kind of be uncomfortable in that space on some level, but they'll, they might form, they'll see it as an alliance of convenience, right? And I think that, and you've, and I think that I don't know if we'll like, and that's the thing, like the politics of the 21st century will just shift. Like there's always been, like, politics has always involved uneasy alliances, right? And I think we're going to have to make some uneasy alliances of our own. But that will be an uneasy alliance that will happen on their side, right? Is that they will make a play for, and you've already seen Ted Cruz has tried. Like he started tweeting about the Republican Party being a working class party, which is obviously insane coming from Ted Cruz, but it shows you where their thinking is at, right? And that at some point they'll, I believe that if they actually do attract a working class base on some level, and they've already made plays for it in the Rust Belt and whatnot. They actually do, then their votes in the Senate will have to change to reflect that, right? So they can't just keep voting as they've always voted and then not change, right? But that's because they're in transition. I think they will change, but they but yeah, I think that, and I think, sorry, I wanted to make a broader point though. I wanted to make a broader point about leftists engaging in that sort of thing, is that it isn't just those who talk about it as an alliance of convenience. There's another group which I've been studying pretty closely, which are the kind of essentially like spiritualist lefties types, right? Like the original hippies. They're making the crossover into the new right, right? And because they're probably not sharing a lot of their views on race or anything like that, but they would see something like they were the original anti-vaxxers, right? If you think about it, and they would see, in the way that like a racial purist might see an injection of a vaccine as a having impure blood, right? You'd also see amongst these leftist sort of spiritual types saying they would see as a form of vaccine, as a form of impurity as well, right? Different reasons, same conclusion, right? And what I'm seeing is the specific convergence point is the atheists on the new right. Like, so there's a lot of young atheists, right, who don't, obviously the new right has a lot of basis. They talk about Judeo-Christian values, right?
Right.
That's a way of saying that, I'm not religious, I don't believe in any of this God bullshit, right? But I am still but I think Judeo-Christian values make sense because Western civilization was built on it. I've heard that line again and again and again. But that still leaves them kind of, existentially uncertain. Where I've seen them, they've been exploring. Like some of them have opted into like weird, like Viking mythology. I don't know if you've seen that at all. Like that was that some white supremacists are doing. So they've opted into like Viking mythology. But where a lot of them are really going is they're opting into kind of new age spirituality that the anti-vaxxer left are bringing to them, because that's much more developed, right? New age spirituality is very well developed, right? I wouldn't say it's entirely coherent, but it's certainly a lot more coherent than anything that the right currently have, other than Christianity itself. And that is the point. The other reason to explain your observation earlier about leftists engaging in right-wing rhetoric, that's the thing that's happening too, right? So, and that should worry us more, because that is fuel for a movement, right? When you're giving them an existential explanation for their beliefs, their political beliefs, right? Saying, because you're serving, if not God, right, then you're serving reality or nature, right? And here's the scariest part of all, right? Is that if you have a new age spiritual person talking about connections with nature, right, and a right-wing person talking about nature, believing in survival of the fittest coming from nature. Sounding a lot like Mein Kampf, isn't it? Right? Is
Very
that
much so.
right? Because the law of nature is a fascist. That's how fascists operate, right? And I'm not just speculating. I've seen these two beliefs directly intersect, right? Because I've been following right-wing trends online, so seeing people hold exactly this, and they also like very anti-feminist believing that women, should be at home or inferior because nature, right?
Or, I mean, the Judeo-Christian one fits that too, obviously. But yeah, whichever route you want to take, it's going to end up in a pretty misogynistic worldview, right?
Right, and that's and these people. I tell you what, these people actually scare me, right? Religious fundamentalists don't scare me as much, right? Even if it's like because like religious as in like Christian fundamentalists, because they still want to go to heaven at the end of the day, right? So there's still some kind of end goal, like there's something beyond this life, right? That is a check on their behavior. It can also
There's at least some leverage for somebody.
It can also, make you want to go blow up a building in the name of your
Right.
God, right? But or commit acts of terrorism. But for the bulk of your society, that's still a fringe element for the most part, right? But if nature itself and just reflecting nature is your end goal, and you believe nature is about being stronger than your opponents, and you believe that like liberalism and equality is just weakness, that is the straight up ingredient for fascism with no existential check on it.
Yep.
Right. So those are the people that scare me, right? Is because they don't have any moral restraint, right? Because they think that their job is to return society to the state of nature, right? To the Leviathan, to the Thomas Hobbes world, right? That's what their view of reality is, right? And that, and they've found and they're finding a way to kind of back that up spiritually as well. That the and it's I mean, there's a lot more. I could talk about this stuff for ages. I know you probably have more questions, but it's fascinating. It's scary, but it's fascinating.
Well, that's, I mean, this is beyond fascinating. I did not think I was going to hear about essentially a hippies to eugenics pipeline here today, but that seems to be kind of what we're witnessing, at least in a sense. Do you think, just quickly, do you think it's, and this might kind of be what you were actually just touching on, so apologies if this is redundant, but do you think it's like, do you think it's more or less dangerous that they don't think they explicitly believe in the nasty parts? Do you see what I mean? Like, if you're going to engage with a group or a coalition or an institution, and you say, but there's parts X, Y, and Z that I don't believe that, but I'm going to do it anyway. Do you find that to be more or less concerning?
I don't fully understand. Can you give me an example?
Like, someone who's not explicitly racist, but is effectively becoming part of a coalition with racists. Do you think that is more, is it more concerning to you that they're willing to, even though they don't quote unquote believe it? Or is it less concerning because at least they don't explicitly quote unquote believe it?
I think that, that's a tough, I think that I'm not sure yet, because I know people like this. Actually, I have one person who used to identify as a progressive, actually, who has fully gone down that route, fully. And they are, and they're for them, it's an alliance of convenience. And I think that for them, because the bigger battle is the battle against the elites, right? So they're willing to do whatever it takes. But I still think that leaves an opening for progressives to re-engage with them, right? Because a point may come when they're because what do progressives offer, right? Or what should we be offering once we're more organized? We should be offering a way to deconstruct the system, right? But without those disgusting beliefs, right? So we're the pathway back, right? So, and I think that when I said earlier that it's kind of a good thing that this is happening, as scary as some of these beliefs are, is that the powers that be change when they see their power is threatened, or they have to change, right? And if they see that they're losing people to the right, people that should actually have been in their camp, right? That's happening, right? That is happening. Then that's leverage for us. That's power for us to shift the system, right? So I think rather than a good or a bad thing, it's a thing. It's a thing we need to exploit, and I think it's a thing that allows us to shift power from within the framework we're working in, and they're also our ticket back. Right? They're the first people we could bring back from the madness, because I think that as long as they haven't, I think so for example, to hypothetical, let's say a racist commune gets set up, right? And it's going to happen. They probably already exist, right?
Yeah.
And someone who doesn't subscribe to the racist stuff but is in there, they'll always feel a little bit uncomfortable, right? Even if that group is there fighting the elites and sharing other, if they also say, well, because there'll always be those little conversations about race, that don't jive, And I think that's how you get back in. It's a long way away, but and maybe we don't, and maybe the pathway back is that if those little societies fail, which a lot of them will, because they don't know how to engage with the outside world, they don't know how to trade. How there's a lot of irrationality, right? So, or maybe they have kids there, and those kids say, look at these failed, or these societies aren't really working, so there's got to be something better out there, right? We have to think long term about this stuff now, because that's where we're at, right?
Yeah, I think that might in part be defending your sanity kind of a thing, right? Because it's hard to look at the world right now. I like the big picture. Yeah. I will say that puts a little optimistic spin on it, that it could be almost like a vacuum of sorts that we could then occupy, right?
Absolutely. No, it's the truth. I mean, look, what is the job of progressives at the end of the day? It's not to accept or reject globalization. It's to provide a better globalization, right? And the term has, because globalization includes things like human rights. It includes things like the ideas of that we're one humanity, and that someone in a third world country should not be economically worse off than us. That is also globalization, right? And it's not as progressives, we'll never ever be able to reject that idea, right?
Right.
Because we will always engage with the world as a whole. But what's on offer from globalization right now is bullshit, right? So we have to provide that middle pathway, right? We have to organize it. We have to make something better, right? And we're the only ones who can do it. I mean that because there's literally no one else situated to do that, right? It's so, yeah.
So optimism with there's a vacuum for us to occupy, and then a little bit of, but you really need to do it because no one else is going to. I think that's a good mix of urgency and optimism there to close this out today.
Yeah, absolutely. And just as a final point on that, where does that leave us is that we need to be offering our own form of identity as well, right? And as I said, class identity is a good first start. It is an excellent start. It's a necessary start. It's how we begin to organize. But we need to go further. And this is a very hard quest. And this will be controversial. I'm sure some of your listeners will be going, "What the hell is he talking about when I say this?" But we need to be exploring our own form of larger spiritual ideas. At least that we'd never force them on anyone ever, because that's not what progressives do, right? But we need to have our own relationship with the universe, right? And that justifies some of our own ideas. Why? Because that's I think is at the heart of what's feeding the right. Is the coldness of the world as it is today the absence of mythology, the absence of a place in the universe is what has forced a lot of people towards the right, because the right offered those things.
Yeah. I think that's a really tremendous point, Vinay, and I appreciate you bringing that perspective here today, because I don't often think a whole lot about that stuff. I think mostly in terms of socioeconomics, and I think you're right that most people engage in society and in politics in a very different way. They're looking at it in a cultural context, and the left needs a response to that. Whether it's the Judeo-Christian or the New Age atheist right-wingers, or the rigid individualism that we see them embracing as a cultural kind of viewpoint or an ideology. We need an answer to that. And I think that does need to be collectivism and whatever other things on the left we can exploit to kind of create a coalition in a sense.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Vinay, thank you so much for taking the time. It was great to have you on, and I am sure we'll talk again soon. Appreciate you coming on today.
No problem. Thanks. Talk to you soon.
So I thought that was a fantastic discussion. As always, Vinay always brings that, added perspective of how, like, a layer removed. Why are people doing this stuff? And I think he's spot on with the idea that the right has an identity that the left does not. And I think that a lot of what we see in politics is based upon people desperately searching for that identity, right? Things like this anti-vax stuff. I think he's exactly right that that's essentially identifying as being opposed to the powers that be, right? So it's not so much the science. It's not so much like I actually oppose the vaccine on grounds X, Y, and Z. It's like I identify with opposing what I'm supposed to do. It's almost like you start to identify with contrarianism, and that fills that vacuum of identity that we've created. So it's that leaves a lot of questions left to be answered. How does the left go about that? What is that identity? How do we uphold our values while providing some sort of cultural identity? So I really appreciated his bringing that perspective, and look forward to talking to Vinay again soon, as always. So I want to get into a